Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the 66th edition Digital Foundry Direct Weekly. It's our E3 Aftermath edition where we mop up a few of the extraneous announcements that have occurred since our last coverage and basically offer our summary on the show and pick up on some news stories that have emerged during the festivities. Joining me first of all, Alex Battaglia.
I'm surprised you didn't sneak in a prequel meme there with the episode 66 thing, Rich. But I'm here, excited to talk about E3, non-E3, and a couple other awesome news items this week, especially ones on PC.
Okay, fair enough. And if you do have an Order 66 joke to get in there, John Linneman is joining us.
I don't have a joke ready. I'm sorry. I was not ready for this. I did not come prepared for this part of the show.
Let's kick off with our first news story. So this one occurred literally last night as we filmed this. Two shows. First of all, one from Square Enix. Secondly, one from Capcom. 10th anniversary for Dragon's Dogma there. Confirmation of Dragon's Dogma 2, but actually no real details beyond that. Square Enix, though, slightly more interested. Slightly more. Actually, quite a lot more interesting. Final Fantasy VII Remake, the sequel, Rebirth, has been revealed along with a trailer. And Crisis Core, the old PSP game, is getting a remaster. I'm going to go to you, John, first of all, on this. Two interesting announcements here, right?
Yeah, so they really are leaning into this sort of world of Final Fantasy VII, I see. And that's not bad. It is their most popular, I think, installment. The original Final Fantasy VII. So yeah, there's Rebirth and there's Crisis Core. And so obviously Rebirth, they don't show a lot, but I do gather from what they show that we're going to be looking at some pretty significant story changes, if you will. I mean, if you finish the remake, it's pretty obvious that they're diverging. It's really a different thing. It is not going to be the same story, and that definitely is what you gather here. But there's not that much more to say about it other than, I like what they're showing visually. It's going to be interesting because Final Fantasy VII was made in a very different era, right? And because they were using pre-rendered backgrounds, they could essentially have the player travel around the entire planet, and you'd visit all these different locations, everything from, you spend the first chunk of hours in Midgar. It's this futuristic sort of cyberpunk looking city in ruins almost. But then you spend a lot of time out in nature, exploring valleys. You're going into other different types of cultures and towns. It's a lot more feasible to do that with that sort of technology, but doing all this stuff in real time and this large scale, that's different, right? So this is going to be a very different looking game in terms of its environments, and we do see that here in the trailer. We saw it kind of at the end of the remake itself. So yeah, I'll be curious to see where they go with that. Obviously the logo has a red tinge to it now for Rebirth, which, we'll see what the final one looks like. The other one, though, Crisis Core, is a little bit more interesting and ambitious. Not more ambitious than the Rebirth, but ambitious in the sense that it does appear to be much more of a remake than I expected. So Crisis Core was the PSP game. I don't know if you guys ever played it, but I did enjoy this back in the day. And it was oh, so you have played a little bit of it.
Yeah.
And can agree, I guess, that for the PSP, it was kind of a technical powerhouse, right?
Absolutely, yeah. It was quite brilliant for the time, yeah, sure.
Yeah, the character model quality, environments, animation work, it really felt like a big budget, like console game on a portable system. But, it was created for a 2004 handheld device, right? That doesn't scale well. And I was originally thinking, what if they just put it out as a PSP Classic or something, which could have happened. But no, they instead seem to have completely rebuilt it. It's likely Unreal Engine, similar to their Trials of Mana remake. And it seems perhaps similar to that, maybe a little more ambitious. Like, you can tell they're not going nearly as big budget as they did with the actual Final Fantasy VII remake and Rebirth, right? The animation work and such is much more, it looks very similar to the PSP game, I would say, which is not a bad thing, but there's definitely a lot going on here visually, and it looks nice. The main thing I'm curious about is if they're going to make any changes to the level design and maps, because, you could tell that a lot of those original areas were somewhat constrained by the PSP. You couldn't go too big or wide with the areas, and there was definitely loading screens at points. And I'll be curious to see if they actually change that aspect of it and sort of expand on the game, or if it's just going to be like just a makeover in the visuals, but it follows the exact design of the original. That's what we don't know yet, right?
Yeah, I mean, there were some interesting notes about Rebirth, specifically that it was only announced for PlayStation 5. I'm sure there'll be a PC version along a year later, but making it specific to PlayStation 5 rules out PlayStation 4, so presumably the scope for the visuals will be
way higher. I mean, I think there's hints of that already in the trailer. So I think the cutscenes in Final Fantasy VII were really great, and like the opening like power plant area was really well done in terms of just like I would say the textures of most materials there and the geometric detail. But then you went to other areas in the game and it was like a JPEG background, or you had like really low resolution textures and things like that. And I think in that aspect, this trailer showed off a lot of ground detail that seemed quite above what we saw already in the original Final Fantasy remake Intergrade. Like that stuff looked quite a bit better. So them saying that this would be PS5 only, that makes a lot of sense. And like the first game, the first remake game had only like one pre-rendered cinematic, as far as I know, in it. Right, like the intro one. So I'd imagine this is probably a real-time look, considering that's what the game seems to have, a lot of real-time cinematics. So I think it already does look quite a bit better than the previous entry.
Did you notice it has touch bending on the foliage?
I did see that, which made me. I thought the foliage was also pretty high res too, and looked very geometric, which is interesting. It did not look like the alpha-tested way of doing foliage, which is very common in games, but more like a something you would expect a next-gen game to maybe try out.
The thing about the original Final Fantasy VII Remake is that you're right, Alex. That specific area, the second area after you when you're going back to Tifa's bar and everything, that whole town is pretty limited on PS4. But the game was a little bit, I guess you could say, inconsistent in that, having finished it, there are other areas that are as nice looking as the power plant. But then there's other areas that are more open that are obviously lacking in detail, right? And I do think Intergrade improved that a lot. The texture quality in general got a nice bump up. So you get less of that nasty JPEG artifact stuff. There was especially a late game thing where you climb in up this one area and it's like sunset, and the entire background was really bad on original PS4. And it was a lot better, but yeah. So that's this is promising though. And the backgrounds here, at least from what we could tell at a glance, look to be mostly geometry instead of like just a picture.
Yes,
so that's good too.
That's a positive.
I was kind of amused at your comment, Alex, there that it just stuck in a JPEG background.
It's what it looks like at times on the PS4. I mean, that was oddly enough a game that I looked at back in the day, and I just remember thinking like, wow, these cutscenes are so good. This first area looks so good, and then you hit the shanty town, and it's like, oi. I'm also, them not being stuck to PS4 means I think we can see like a lot larger areas with denser detail, because PS4 was super, and PS4 Pro were super memory bound, it felt like in that game. Based upon the way textures were loading, it's like the texture just never loaded. Unlike when they updated the game and released it also for PC, that you could see that actually that door texture is high res. It just never ever loaded on the old version of the game.
I hope that that door texture, I would love for that to make a cameo in Rebirth. Like maybe even like a summon where you summon the low res door and it makes your enemies low res or something. I don't know.
That'd be funny. They already have a bunch of joke summons and joke characters in the game anyway, so it'd be perfect.
Just imagine, Alex, with the power of the PlayStation 5, they could upgrade that JPEG to a PNG.
I know, right? Or they could go straight TIFF if they wanted, probably.
Oh my.
Oh my. Yeah. Tifa, TIFF, I don't know.
You may well be over-promising there. But yeah, interesting. Very long time to wait, though. It's coming out on PlayStation 5 winter next year. So I guess we have to wait another year for the PC version.
Wait, so if that's the case, then next year's going to be pretty big for Final Fantasy, right? Because they're saying FF16 in summer of next year, and then this in the winter. And as far as we know, they're both just for PS5 and then likely PC.
So, Alex, something else I picked up on today is that Final Fantasy VII Remake is coming to Steam. It's been liberated from the Epic Game Store. It's coming to Steam. It's going to be apparently Steam Deck compatible. Wondering what you make of that, bearing in mind that the PC port is a bit of a debacle, right?
Yeah, well, okay, so
unless you run it under DX11.
Unless you run it under DX11, then it's a bit better, but it still isn't perfect for a lot of reasons. I saw that they were updating the Steam Depot a while back, and they didn't even comment the name out. It just said Final Fantasy VII Remastered. I thought that was pretty funny. But here I hope that if they do release it on Steam, that they take the effort to push out some needed updates that game should have, beyond the fact that the DX12 that it launches with doesn't really work like you should imagine DX12 would in terms of stability of performance and all these things. They need some very generic real full screen exclusive support for the DX12 render, which it kind of has but doesn't really, and then also in-game VSync toggle, a greater ability to adjust visual settings, because Unreal Engine has all these things by default as the SG dot. They don't even provide all of that for the character, for you. It's just they didn't spend the time on the UI and the polish that you would expect of a game like that. So I'm hoping that when it does drop on Steam, that it does have some of these things that you really expect for PC games to have.
Yeah, I was reading on, I actually read that news on PC Gamer, the website, saying that it's coming to Steam, and said at the end, which kind of made me chuckle but also groan simultaneously, to give a bit of background to their story. They were talking about how the game launched in a pretty poor state with stuttering issues. And, it's just well, hold on a minute. It's a significantly far after launch now, and it's still got those stuttering issues. Nothing has changed. It wasn't a launch problem. It's a game problem.
There's rumor, I don't know where it came from, but somewhere around February and January of last year, everyone was the new NVIDIA driver totally fixed stuttering in Final Fantasy VII. We tested that internally. I tested that internally, and I just it ran the exact same, really poorly. So I have no idea where that idea comes from, but it literally is still the same game. I think a lot of people just maybe had the shader cache already there, or they moved on to a different area of the game that has different performance or something like that. But it really is almost the exact same game as launch. Just the DRS changed and the ability to cap the frame rate differently. That's really about it.
I'm curious if Valve could do any kind of special work with Proton for the Steam Deck version, right? That could actually solve some of these problems. So we've seen them do work in this area before, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Elden Ring. They do shader caches for a lot of titles. Mm-hmm. So
it could potentially run well on Steam Deck and better than a lot of other PCs, or at least I think
at least the DX12 version, yeah.
Yeah. I'm very curious to see it running on something like the Steam Deck, though, because presumably it should at least match or exceed a PS4 version, which is pretty impressive for a mobile system, right? That's awesome.
The game is actually really easy to run when it does run. I was just doing some semi-related shader compilation stutter recordings the other day, and I was running a CPU at 1.2 gigahertz, actually. A Core i9 at 1.2 gigahertz just to see what happens when it runs the game. And it actually runs at above 60 FPS still, excluding shader comp stutters. So that's kind of cool. So I think it actually does bear really well for the Steam Deck running that game.
Assuming the shaders are
Assuming the shaders are, yeah.
Well, that's all we've really got to say about Final Fantasy for the time being. But let's move on to our next topic. This isn't really a specific topic as such, but at the time of recording, we've literally just had the last presentations of Summer Game Fest period, E3 period, whatever you want to call it. It's kind of been a bit weird this summer. I just wanted to get some feedback from the team about your overall takeaways, which shows were hit, which were a miss, the best titles, maybe. I'm going to go to you first, John.
Ooh, this one was a tricky one because to me, I felt like the show in general felt rather scattered, right? And kind of spread out in a way that was a little bit of a bummer in some ways. It was still...
Isn't that always the case, though? You'd have EA, Sony, Microsoft, Ubisoft, they'd all
do their
sort of
thing.
spread out their presentation. So, but you're right. It's kind of like a 1 week period stretched out to 2, really, isn't it?
Yeah, there was something. It just didn't have that focal point, and it didn't have the excitement. But there was still stuff for sure. I mean, I would say Jeff Kahn itself did pretty well. There was some reveals at his show that were phenomenal, I thought. Obviously, there was all the sci-fi stuff. Callisto Protocol in particular was a real standout for me. We got proper Street Fighter 6 in there, which is really cool. There was, of course, the Last of Us remake, which, that is what it is. That's interesting. What was the... There was that one game that was re-revealed. Routine. Yeah, that was a surprise, and that looked great. I would also say, we had things like the Resident Evil patches dropping in the middle of all this. There was the State of Play before that, where we got Resident Evil 4 Remake, which looked really great. We got a really nice Final Fantasy 16 trailer as well. We got this Final Fantasy stuff. I mean, all of this stuff was great news. We finally got to see the new Forza, and it looks phenomenal. They finally showed Starfield, all this kind of stuff. Like, when you break it down like that, there's a lot of great stuff, but I don't feel like it had any of the same impact or excitement that some of the past shows have offered. But at the same time, it's really difficult to nail that, I think. And do you feel like there was any specific titles where you saw that, or like a talk of the show title, like no matter how it turned out in the end, Cyberpunk 2077 dominated some of those E3 shows. Like, when they showed that at that first show, that was the talk of the town. Everybody was like, wow, look at this. And usually each year has a title like that.
You're right. There wasn't a title like that, but I would contend that the Forza Motorsport trailer was possibly the closest we got to that.
That was a really good trailer, wasn't it? Like,
I mean, just
love
the
that
makeup of that
presentation.
trailer, the way they did it, the demonstration, the sort of camera movements from one feature to the next, the way it was scripted.
Oh man,
and just the content that they showed is everything that you'd want from a racing game in the next generation, right?
Yeah, it feels like a proper next generation iteration of Forza versus, like, say, GT7, which felt very cross-gen, right? So, I mean, I'm happy to see that. They've taken a while because they were cranking out Forza games so much for years, and they finally were given the opportunity to sort of slow down and try to rebuild it. And this is the first time we've seen that in a while, and it's great.
That was my standout trailer for the whole sort of period. But at the same time, I think you're right, John, that there's no one singular game that everybody is talking about.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I don't really know what to make of that. Alex, highlights of the E3 period, which isn't E3.
Yeah, highlights for me are actually not from any of the shows that we really discussed, but I thought the PC Gamer show, as well as we had Steam Next Fest as well too, and those actually felt to me, barring the fact that AAA graphics are not exactly the show-stealing element of that, but actually like gameplay and ambition of design is usually the talk of the town there. And that was the really cool stuff. We got to see a greater look into the System Shock remake, which looked really, really, really good. Like, that's probably going to be absolutely amazing. That's like a DF Retro in the waiting right there. So there's that. And then we also had, we got the surprise drops of Resident Evil 2, 3, 7, etc. with ray tracing. But on PC, there was like drops of so many game demos, and they were all really good. I've only played 3 of them so far, all of them first-person shooters, oddly enough. But there's a couple other there that I'm also really interested in that are coming out towards the latter half of the year. Things like Culted, Trepang 2, Celarco, and all those games that just look really, really good. So that stuff I found was really great. In terms of the AAA beats, I think even though it wasn't, always positive discussion, Starfield's definitely dominated discourse in a way that is kind of interesting. I think, people are talking about, I wish people would spend a little bit less time on the graphics there, even though we're a graphics channel, but I wonder if there's a really interesting discussion there when we have more gameplay details about game design, because I think they're trying to do something that it seems like an iteration on their concepts, and, say what you will, they tend to do a pretty good job at making that open world thing. So I'm curious to see how that plays out in the end for them. But my kind of last commentary here regarding E3, not E3, is that I was not a fan of what was happening in regards to like what was being shown always, and the transparency about graphics, the transparency about platforms, and like very specifically the Microsoft E3, not E3 showcase, where with Forza, like initially, like it sounds like this could be Xbox Series X, and like in the presentation themselves, as they show this really cool demo that we just saw, this 5-minute long demo, they even like expressly call out Xbox Series X and Xbox Series S, and you think like, oh, they're showing off that, like that's why you would call those things out. But then it's like actually running on PC, and then they have this other trailer that comes out alongside it that they don't show off on the stage there, but you watch it and you look at it, and I was telling you guys on Slack, like, oh, this looks quite a bit better than the other trailer, and there's actually some like reasons why it looks better. And then after the fact, they come out again and say, okay, that's running in the replay mode of the game, and like that has ray trace GI, which is something I'd usually get really excited about, but here, due to the lack of transparency, I'm actually a little bit soured on like this, because I think when you show games off, you should really show the game off as the game itself, running, as you expect it to look on launch day, to a degree. And it's old hat in video games to just show off CG trailers, to show off things that are not what the game will actually look like. But I think as an industry, we have to like really get past that. It's kind of dishonest. It's just dishonest. And it doesn't hype me at all for a game to see stuff that isn't what the game actually looks like. Actually, it just disappoints me. So I hope Microsoft very specifically gets better at that. I wish Forza Horizon and Motorsport were shown off in a way that was more transparent as to what we should expect for in-game graphics.
Okay, yeah, there's some additional context we need to add there, which is that there's actually 3 trailers that we're talking about here. There's two Forza Motorsports, and the in-game trailer was in-game, but it was in-game on PC. Then we had the secondary trailer. I can't remember if that had in-game.
It says in-game 4K. In-game at 4K
on the sizzle
reel thing. Yeah,
right. Okay, so that is in-game, but it's the replay view.
Yeah,
and it's 60 FPS, right?
Yeah, it's like straight 4K, perfect anti-aliasing. It looks quite a bit better than the demo, actually. Yeah,
as you'd expect, if it's in replay mode, right? But it's also running at 60 frames per second, which I can't believe is going to be the case on Series X. Yeah, there's that. And then there's the third trailer, which was the Hot Wheels, Forza Horizon 5 Hot Wheels, which is, we know it's going to be awesome because Forza Horizon 5 is awesome and the Hot Wheels on FH3 was awesome. But we were seeing the ray tracing feature set from Forza Motorsport, which isn't out in this trailer. It was ray trace reflections on the vehicles in game, and it was reflections of the other vehicles, right? So, which I did email Microsoft about this, but they're saying that that Forza Horizon 5 isn't getting a ray tracing upgrade. They just suspect that those features, which may have been there for marketing reasons, I don't know. They didn't say that, but the fact is they were saying, well, maybe we had an in-game build there which did have these features enabled, which may well be a mistake. But the point is that if it's in-game in their internal build, but not going to make it into final code, it shouldn't be there, I think is the point, right? And I think that when you start talking about disclosure, you've got to be on the ball with this, right? If it's in-game, it's the PC version, say it's the PC version. I mean, they were saying in their communications to us that the Series X version will be very, very similar, of a similar visual quality. And I don't actually doubt that because it's Turn 10. But you don't lose anything just by saying this is the PC version, but we're aiming for very close visual parity on Xbox Series X. That solves the problem, right? And I still think, as we've noted in previous directs, the transparency sort of model has been basically established now with Sony in State of Play. Everything captured on PS5. If it isn't, they say. If it's a cinematic, they say. That's it. That's all you need to do. Everybody's happy. So yeah. And I think, ultimately the concept of adding in features into promotional trailers that may not be in the final game is a no-no that should not be happening. And here's the thing, right? You don't need to make these games look anything better than the final version, because it's actually really difficult these days to actually find a game that doesn't look great. That's the thing, right? So
we know how good Forza Horizon looks, right? Like they don't need to do this. There's no reason to do it because it's awesome looking. Although, didn't they? I did want to mention they mentioned in a stream, I guess, that they're adding TAA to Forza Horizon 5. Is that right, Alex?
It's like I think it was mentioned as part of the stream, but if you go to Steam and they look at their Season 9 or whatever update they call it, it explains that they're adding TAA into the PC version, which
awesome.
is it's not expected, but it's what we wanted.
No. Yeah, exactly.
It was like one of our core complaints about the graphics on launch was it doesn't have decent AA for whatever it's doing. Like MSAA is just not enough. So them adding that is
for
great.
foliage.
Exactly, because MSAA doesn't have coverage for foliage and transparency like
barely,
that, right?
Yeah.
Unless, I mean, there's ways to do it, but it doesn't, right? So you get that kind of sparkly, shimmery foliage that TAA will clean up completely. So looking forward to that. That's great.
But yeah, it's interesting to bring up some of these points here, particularly the fact that there wasn't a game of the show, and it should have been Starfield, I think, which raises the question of why it wasn't. And I think maybe in that case, the transparency was probably to its credit, because it was actually showing the game as it is, and the game as it is right now clearly has technical issues that do need to be resolved. If it can't hold 30 on whatever system they were running it on, that is slightly concerning. But, it is entirely in line with what we've seen from previous BGS releases, where they don't have perfect performance at launch, but fingers crossed they can actually get a consistent 30. I'm kind of curious as to why they couldn't, bearing in mind the next-gen nature of it. I mean, if you look back at Fallout, Skyrim, etc., PC versions have always significantly outperformed the consoles, even when they did have issues.
I mean, even still, as I say in my own Starfield video, I feel like they do deserve some credit for showing something like this, right? They didn't polish it up, it seems, beyond where it was. At least it seems that way. Like they were showing what seemed to be the genuine article running, which is what we were asking for, and warts and all. And I respect that. And obviously, with the scale of this game, I think I think the thing about when talking about graphics, we always get hung up on all this rendering features expensive, or this resolution's too high, and all kinds of things like that. But I think in this case, it's probably much more beneath the surface, sort of underlying things that are bottlenecking the game, right? And probably more on the CPU side than the GPU side. And we don't know yet, but I suspect that's more what's going on, because their games are stupidly ambitious. Just the fact that like they actually track the persistence of objects. I assume they'll do that in Starfield, but it's like if you place an object somewhere, they have to keep track of all this, and there's all these different objects that you can interact with and move around, and there's just those types of things don't necessarily come cheap, and most other games don't try to do that.
I suspect that for many people it will have been the game of the show, simply because if you're a fan of that type of title from that developer, it's better than anything they've ever done, right? And the scale and the scope and the visual quality, it's just on a new level. So I suspect that presentation would have blown away a huge amount of the audience.
I mean, even with its flaws, it looks visually nice, which is something I can't say about Fallout 4. I think Fallout 4 is an ugly game. It's always been an ugly game. I do not like the way it looks, but this one looks like actually attractive. The planets look appealing to explore. They've done a good job there. It's definitely the best looking thing they've ever done by far, which not too surprising, but it's good to see.
Yeah, I was actually reminded in terms of overall impressions of Fallout 3, which when it appeared on Xbox 360, I thought, hey, this is actually a really good looking game.
Oh, jeez,
And it
Rich.
did have all of the BGS stuff.
Here's Alex going, I didn't think that game looked good at all. Yeah, I don't know. Like talking about just really quickly, their output in the past. I've always felt that since like the original Xbox, like 360 early stuff, like Oblivion, that they've gone for like the wrong rendering paradigms a couple times. Like I always felt like that Fallout 3 was a little too of the era, unlike Oblivion, which was like still had its foot in the past and actually was kind of really attractive, I think, for the time it released. And I think for like Skyrim and Fallout 4, my goodness, those games, they're very open-ended for sure, but they're just like lacking in core areas of visuals that I think look attractive.
Remember though, Oblivion has Palm at the beginning,
I know.
we discovered.
That's better than whatever Fallout 4 was doing, for sure.
That's right. Before we move on, I do just want to say, at least if you're checking out those Steam demos, the 3 that I recommend checking out right away is, we've talked about it before, but Sulaco. You can get a demo of that. Very cool. There's Gloomwood, which I've been waiting for, which is essentially like a rebirth of Thief. I'll recommend that. And then also Agent 64. Did you guys see that?
Yes, I have.
Yeah.
It's very cool.
That's super rad. It's like 64 in the title, Agent. You can imagine it's sort of like a modern, pseudo-modern take on GoldenEye style game. It's cool though. So definitely check those out.
Well, that raises actually the final lingering mystery of E3, which is what happened to GoldenEye. And I'm wondering whether it's actually something that's going to be announced by Nintendo in a forthcoming direct.
Whoa, that would be interesting.
I mean, what's going on there?
I was thinking about this, and I can't say for sure, but I can't help but wonder if it has something to do with the war happening right now. Just, I don't know, just releasing a game where you're going around shooting Russians. I don't know, maybe they're afraid of sparking some kind of thing.
Nintendo has done that in the past. I mean, this is Microsoft and Nintendo, but they just recently did it with
Advance Wars,
right? So
that's what I mean. Nintendo is very cautious about these things, even if it doesn't seem like that much of a connection. We know how Nintendo is about this stuff. They don't want to rock the boat. So I do wonder if that had something to do with it.
Okay, but I think that's going to round everything off for our E3 discussion for this year. And we're going to move on now to a series of smaller news stories that caught our eye. First one here is basically just a PSA, which is to say that we recently did a review of the PlayStation 1 and PSP and PS2 classics on the revised PlayStation Plus subscription service. Weren't particularly impressed, and the key criticism there, the key critique, was that in the Asia region at least, a lot of the games were PAL versions, which is to say they ran at 50 hertz, they ran slowly, and they were kind of crammed into a 60 hertz container. They tried to mitigate it with a disastrous ghosting filter, which, the enormity of such is still sort of baffling me. But this PSA, actually, John, why don't you talk us through it?
The new PlayStation service has launched in North America, and as we had hoped, they did indeed launch with the North American versions of games, which was also true where in Japan they launched with Japanese versions. Naturally, these are going to be 60 hertz. Now, the caveat here is that this does fix that problem. It doesn't fix anything else that I pointed out in that video. And there's definitely still, especially with the PS1 stuff, there's definitely still issues. But still, that's encouraging. Which means, though, that the last concern, and I suspect, unfortunately, this is going to turn out to be the case in Europe, I suspect that we're going to get the PAL versions as well. Just because they seem to be sticking to the original sort of release territories of the different versions. So, and in some of these, it doesn't make sense, because I was thinking at first, oh, maybe it's a language thing. But in reality, I think like Ape Escape, for instance, I don't think it actually has alternative languages, or at least some of these games do not. So it doesn't even matter. Although that one does have a different, the localization actually with Ape Escape, it got three different voice recordings, completely different. So 2 extra localizations on top of the Japanese one. There's the British one, and then there's the American one, and they're very, very different, which is interesting.
But the point is that if you are subscribing in the US territories, you can disregard the the 50 hertz critique from ARM.
Correct. That's the
not
point.
the rest of it.
Not the rest of it.
But that is the most major problem, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Far and away. It just makes the games look choppy and not smooth at all. So yeah, that's good news if you're in the US.
And we are going to update on the European situation as well, as and when it becomes clear, which may even be in the next week. We shall see. But let's move on to the next topic. So this one kind of came out of nowhere, and it's absolutely fascinating. We've seen in the past decompilation projects for Nintendo titles, most notably Super Mario 64, where essentially the original code is reverse engineered and then rebuilt from scratch, which basically means that there's no copyright concerns, right? Because it's brand new code. It's simply doing the same things as the original. Import the assets from your legal version of the game, and you can access brand new versions on multiple platforms with a huge amount of enhancements. Now, typically this has been reserved for Nintendo titles, but this week it was revealed that Jak and Daxter has been decompiled and rebuilt for PC. I'm going to go to you, Alex, on this because it's quite exciting, isn't it?
The reason why these things are interesting is what you talked a little about there at the end, is that with emulation, you are limited by the original code base, and you're limited by so that means you, like, in terms of inputs, in terms of like rendering resolution and the way things scale, it's very limited. And that stuff, especially for the PS2 era, is always questionable. It's not perfect in the emulation scene at all. And here with a decomp project, you can have it rendering natively. In this case, it's OpenGL on a PC, or if anyone wants to take the time, they could port it to anything. Like, they could technically port it to a Switch. They could port it to an Xbox, the original Xbox, if they really wanted to. That's the really interesting thing here, is we get to see this code running more natively. And then afterwards, it can mean enhancements, like we saw with Super Mario 64. We have the really cool Render 96 project, or the ray tracing work done by Dario Sama. And that's the stuff that I would imagine is going to happen in the future for Jak and Daxter. Its current state, though, it was just really publicized. It's still not in a complete state. Like, if you were to try and download it now, you'd be limited to playing the game. You couldn't enhance the resolution, but, like, controls are a little bit more limited, as well as the fact that there's no sound currently in the build. It just doesn't work. The sound doesn't currently work. So it's playable from start to finish, but it is not a complete thing yet, and it's going to take a little bit of time. Another thing that I kind of want to point out is that it is, interestingly, unlike the Super Mario 64 project, which kind of ran on everything, this, at the gate, requires AVX, at least. So I think that's... What was the first AVX? Was that, like, I don't know, maybe Sandy Bridge, like Sandy Bridge and above kind of processor. So I'm tempted to almost write on their Git, like, make something that's like SSE or SSC2 release of this as well too, because it feels like it should run just fine on older processors, but they have compatibility flags in there probably because they only thought about modern porting.
It's worth pointing out also that sometimes AVX is arbitrarily disabled on lower-end processors like the Pentiums and whatnot.
They're fast enough for sure, but yeah. So it's really good, I think, if they can, to do that. The last thing that I want to talk about is, I think this is near and dear to John's heart, is the fact that these games on PS2, they don't scale too well with resolution usually. PS2 had pretty low video memory, and, a lot of the games were about, like, semi-post-processing in that era, and it had a, like, very distinct look. And if you blow them up to higher resolutions, it can lose a little bit of the charm. And in this case, I want to point out the fact that it's OpenGL. So if you are running an NVIDIA card, at least, I haven't checked out on AMD in a while, but you could run the game at something like 640 by 480 and just pump up SSAA in the NVIDIA control panel, which would give you the game's, like, more native HUD elements, but also, like, keep the level of fidelity down, will give you perfect anti-aliasing. So that's probably how I'm going to try the game out when I do give it a chance. So definitely watch out for it. I kind of feel like we should almost cover it at some point in some capacity, because it's really cool.
Yeah, there's plans to do both the sequels as well, 2 and 3, as well as 1, I believe. John, any notes on this?
Yeah, I mean, one of the weirdest things about this that I'm curious about is that So the original game was programmed using like a very old school Lisp derived language, which is actually one of the oldest high level languages ever. I think the only thing older than it is maybe Fortran. But they had their own sort of like version of this, I guess, dialect, if you will. I think it was Goal. I think game oriented assembly Lisp is what they called it. So this is the original game, at least, was programmed in a way that's very different from what we see like now, or even at the time that was really uncommon. So I'm actually curious to learn more about the way this was reverse engineered, and like, I don't know, it's a fascinating thing because I really didn't think something like this was going to happen. Yeah, beyond that side of things, I am very curious to see how it scales up, because like Alex mentioned, if you emulate a PS2 game, like for instance, Jak and Daxter is a game that uses the original. The sequels support progressive scan and full frame buffer, but the original actually is an interlaced game. And with PCSX2, if the game itself is producing an interlaced image internally, you can't really like work around that. You have to de-interlace it still, because interlaced rendering, it is actually drawing alternate frames. Like you have like, only 224 lines per frame, and it rapidly, it's like, back and forth between them. That's what it's drawing. And it doesn't scale well on PCSX2, I feel. It's really designed to look right on a CRT. So, by essentially eliminating that problem, we can have a super sharp version. I guess the PS3 remaster didn't have that problem either, because that must have been rebuilt somewhat, but that was also missing some of the graphics effects. So this is a really interesting test, because these games really use the PS2 in interesting ways, and I'm curious to see how all this translates over and runs on the PC.
Obviously, PC gaming at the moment has a bit of a problem. The problem is stutter. I don't quite know where to begin with this one, except to say that Alex has been tracking it for many months now, and the situation has seemingly not been getting better. But there is hope on the horizon that for Unreal Engine titles, at least, which have been the focus of our ire, things might be changing. So, Alex, why don't you talk us through the process by which you uncovered this
Yes.
welcome information?
So 2 days ago, Epic was holding a open Q&A on their Unreal Engine forum website, which I've never actually used before. So it was kind of interesting to see. And it was interview with Brian Karras, Sebastian Hilaire, and Daniel Wright. Sebastian Hilaire, volumetric rendering person; Brian Karras, Nanite; Daniel Wright, Lumen. Those are like the headers of those projects. And the Unreal Engine stuff, all those things, Nanite, Lumen, their new volumetrics, all gorgeous stuff. But I kind of took this opportunity to pose a question there that was actually, in the end, not answered by any of those three, but just by some random person that joined the conversation, even though they didn't need to. Another rendering programmer there, an engineer named Kenzo Ter Elst. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing your name correctly. I'm very sorry if I didn't. So they responded back to my question, which was covering... I said, based upon my experience with Unreal Engine 5, that it is very single thread limited when it comes down to it. And also the shader compilation stutter issue that I've talked about in so many videos, and I'm going to have a dedicated video coming out that is, once again, always kind of churning on in the background, that I thought this was a big issue in Unreal Engine 4 and 5. And they responded back, indeed. Let me scroll down here. In regards to PSO stutter, I'm going to read this verbatim just so we can get a sense of exactly what Care said here about it. Yes, we are actively trying to improve this. It's currently still in development phase with some local prototypes, but we hope we can deliver an automatic PSO gathering system at runtime to pre-cache all possible required PSOs which could be needed. The pre-cache request is done as soon as an asset is loaded on a background thread. All possible needed PSOs are collected and pre-cached at that point in them. So this will also include cascaded Niagara effects, something that the old PSO system did not do, by the way, plus all possible shadow and light types. Currently, we're focusing on packaged games, but we are hoping to extend this to the editor as well at some point, so we can see how things go first. this is excellent news. The system that's being described here, I think, is a much more reasonable system than the current way it's done in Engine. I don't know if I want to get into this right now, but this is more, the way it sounds here, it's described here, it actually reminds me a lot more of the way it's done in Horizon Zero Dawn's most recent patch, as in there's like a background thread that when assets are called in to be displayed on screen, and this usually happens not at the moment before they're displayed, by the way, this happens a little bit beforehand, that it starts automatically compiling the required PSOs in the background threads, and not at the moment when it pops up, or also not at the moment when you load up the game. This actually sounds a little bit more asynchronous than like the usual pre-compilation step we're used to seeing in games. This actually sounds very modern and very good. And it would allow for a game to pre-cache or have the shader cached already for very diverse content types, because it would just be what's local to your content. And there's some ramifications of this. It would mean you requiring a better CPU to just play the game at higher frame rates usually. But I feel like this is a great modern way to look at it.
The issue at the moment is essentially that the shaders are compiled as they are needed, right at the moment they are needed, and the game momentarily freezes until the compilation is complete.
It's brutal. Right? Yeah, it's terrible stuff. It makes the games, in my humble opinion, almost unplayable. The one thing I'm a little worried about here is that ever since, was it 4.27 launch, it seems like all energy and initiatives about Unreal are about pushing things into Unreal Engine 5 and Unreal Engine 4 is legacy to a degree. And if this system is limited to UE5, it could present a problem for all those projects that are currently working on Unreal Engine 4. And they would have to do it maybe the old way, which could we could still have, in the immediate future, we could still have many Unreal Engine 4 releases that have this issue, is a little thing I'm worried about. So I'm hoping that when this does come out of the prototyping stage, that it is also in some way workable for Unreal Engine 4 as well, because there's still a lot of UE4 titles in development, or that exist, that could maybe be patched.
That was my first reaction to your news yesterday, right, Alex, which is, what about all the existing games that have this issue? And there are a lot of them. I mean, you know, it's just really concerning on a number of fronts for me. I think the most concerning thing from my perspective is that we seem to be the only ones talking about it. But at least we're talking about it in a way that is actually, you know, bringing it to the attention of the right people and trying to affect change without doing, you know, a massive takedown / call out video, which isn't really our style. But at the same time, this should be called out, right? Because when you're dealing with games that have got like, you know, 1 second freezes on a Core i9 10900K, holy crap, that's awful. And you know, in the investigations that I think you're doing at the moment, we're going to be scaling that back to mainstream CPUs where the situation can only be worse. It's got to be sorted out, and I'm really happy to see that it's an issue that Epic is taking seriously. But at the same time, there is this matter of, you know, years worth of games that do need addressing, because, you know, if you're a PC gamer and you're investing a lot more money into your system than you would in a console, you expect better performance. And yes, you're getting that better performance, but when your game is grinding to a halt to compile a shader, you're not getting a better game, you're getting a much worse game. That's kind of like been the big issue here, and fingers crossed this is the first step to addressing it, certainly on the Unreal side. But I think the other point to take away from this is that it's not specifically an Unreal issue, although I think it's simply the proliferation of Unreal Engine 4 games that is sort of putting the focus on Epic. But if we go back to, like, you know, just off the top of my head, Battlefield 5, that had similar issues, right?
Yeah, and it still will. Elden Ring had, you know, it's a little bit different now, but Elden Ring had it, and then there's, you know, I'm pretty sure like Deus Ex Mankind Divided had it at launch originally.
One of the first examples I remember encountering this, and this is something they've actually had spent a lot of time trying to solve, is Dolphin, the emulator, right? Like early on, games were running super high frame rates, high res, but you were getting so much shader comp stutter in that in that thing. And they poured a ton of effort into finding solutions to this problem. And now it is actually it works very well now. But back in the day, that was one of the worst examples of it, especially because those games were never really designed to be presented that way. And, there was no sort of prediction for when it would occur. And yeah, it was pretty bad. So,
And you've already highlighted another issue, which was resolved, which was Horizon Zero Dawn, which had profound issues at launch, but since Nixis took over the development of the game, it was solved. Essentially, it was background compiling as you play, which seems to be the way forward here. But yeah, I mean, this is basically a big step forward. I mean, it's not going to fix everything immediately, but there's an awful lot of games coming out in 2023 on Unreal Engine 4/5, and if it's resolved by then fingers crossed that at least the new games will be addressed.
I was just thinking, Alex, this kind of takes me back to Unreal Engine 3 in a way, and a problem that and I've always wondered if this is just something to do with the way they handle the PC differently, but on Unreal Engine 3 games, it was very common on the consoles to load in game data while a video played, right? That was just like the thing they always did to hide loading screens. But as far as I know, every PC version of an Unreal Engine game, that feature was removed, and they would play the video and then they would load the data, right? That happened every single time. And it also happened with Crysis 2.
Yes, it does. I hate that
right?
in Crysis 2, by the way.
And that's I always thought there was an interesting difference there, and it just seems like the way, if there's some kind of connection to just the way they're handling like data loading in the PC versus a console where it's predictable.
Yeah, so I mean, we've always talked about Unreal. Like Unreal has had stuttering issues for a while, both in 3 and 4 on PC and on consoles to a certain degree. And I think there's just actually a lot of older style baggage in there. Like when low-level APIs came out on the PC side of things specifically, and even on the consoles there, that they were still working under different paradigms. And I think those have led to bottlenecks over time that we're not seeing in other engines that made more dramatic switches to these low-level APIs. And that actually technically asked the second question here, talking about the single-threaded nature of Unreal. And they said they're also working on that too, because they currently have like a dedicated render thread, which is actually an older style of like the way you use these lower level APIs. And they're going to try and farm off more stuff from that to worker threads. So getting more parallelization in there, which I think the engine also desperately needs.
Yeah, for high frame rates especially, this is super necessary.
Yeah, or for just being above 30 and a constant 60, pretty important.
Interesting that you were talking about the concept of streaming in game data as the cinematics were playing out there, John, on Unreal Engine 3. I'm wondering whether that was due to the way they could custom map out the way the data is stored on the disk. Which would be a completely different setup on a hard drive.
That is kind of a crazy thing to think about, is that they were streaming video and game data from an optical disc.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Most of those games weren't necessarily installed.
Yeah, all those 360 ones, right? Yeah,
that's wild. That's. I do know Absolutely. That one of the reasons that the proliferation of Bink video has to do with its super low CPU overhead, apparently, that makes it much easier to sort of manage a video stream, a lower bitrate video stream, while also fetching data and doing other stuff in the background. But it is a shame, because actually video in general is something that Unreal Engine for many years seemed to really struggle with. Every game, especially on PC, that used video clips at all, the video playback was always terrible. Like, it was not properly frame paced at all, and it just looked juddery, stuttery, bad. And of course, there was a mismatch with the real in-game graphics as well. And man, I feel like we're finally kind of mostly past that, but that was a real issue for a while.
Potentially good news there, but I still think your video needs to put the whole issue into context. And obviously, I think I've said to you in the past, we need to do the double-blind taste test video, which is simply capture it on PS5, capture the same content on PC, no frame rate graphs, nothing. Just run the two side by side and ask, passerby, anybody, which one looks better. I mean, because that's the extent of the issue here. I mean, my concern is that because it's Digital Foundry highlighting it, people will think it's a nitpick. But it's not a nitpick. It's visible to anybody that's got eyes, basically, right?
Stutters are so visible. Like lower frame rates, people don't see it, but like something stopping for like a split second,
Yeah.
almost any human being should see that. So yeah.
So, well, especially if it's like half a second a second.
Yes, yeah.
A second is 0 frames per second.
Yeah.
I think people can realize that something's amiss there. But if we do want to talk about nitpicks, I am going to go back to Jeff Con Summer Games Fest, where Jeff had his nice motion graphics that had no anti-aliasing whatsoever.
That's right.
Oh, poor Jeff.
We're pixel counting the motion graphics.
Yeah, it was kind of bizarre, pixel counting Jeff's motion graphics. But yeah, it was no AA there, which I thought was just quite funny. We're going to be diving straight on in to Supporter Q&A. This is where every week on the DF Supporter Program, we post an appeal for questions to our backers, and they can ask whatever they like, whether it's in-depth technical questions or just basic general trivia. And we've certainly got a mixed bunch this week. Going into the first question here, this one's from Mark Smith. Seeing how advanced the forthcoming Forza Motorsport is, how long do you think it has been in development compared to the recently released GT7? They seem to have pushed the envelope for what a car-driving simcade racer can be with its visual capabilities and focus on current-gen console hardware and PC. It seems as though Polyphony took a more conservative approach to GT7. Do you think this was a good decision on their part, knowing what Turn 10 may have been working on? Tricky one, right, John? Because, you know, there are two games coming at two different parts of the console life cycle, essentially, and they were started at different times. When do you think Turn 10 began work on Forza Motorsport? Pretty much directly after Forza Motorsport 7, you'd suspect, right?
I would imagine so. And that came a year after GT Sport, I think. So the thing about this, though, is I think Polyphony Digital has had real issues with scaling up their development ever since the PS3 era, where you could really feel like with the sheer amount of time it took for them to release GT5, all the limitations it had, and then they did GT6, and it really felt like they were trying to push, like in the old era, they were like, well, we got 1,000 cars, we've got, like 100 tracks, we've got all this stuff. GT4 on the PS2 was like the absolute pinnacle of just accomplishing all of that stuff and making it super polished from top to bottom. And then they're like, well, we're going to do this again on PS3. And I think the problem here is that as the cars get far more detailed, far more complex, everything gets more complex, just managing all that, creating all those assets, simulating all that stuff, the scale of the work has increased so much. I don't think that Polyphony is outsourcing as much as like Turn 10 might and other modern developers tend to do. I don't actually know what the current situation is at. Like, I don't really know what they're doing, but from what I've heard, they don't do enough of that. They really insist on keeping things in-house. And I think Gran Turismo Sport was for them a chance to sort of like reboot themselves, and like they tossed away the PS3 stuff, they restarted the engine, and they made a smaller scale game. And then GT7 was, okay, let's take what we built with Sport and make it into a full-fledged GT game. So the GT7 project that we have now, I think, was entirely derived from their early PS4 work. And it's like, this is the complete version of what we started probably back in like 2014 or 2013 even. And then they finally have released it on their own time schedule. Whereas it's pretty clear that Turn 10 was like, all right, we've done a game for Xbox One X right when that system launched. I think they had heard the criticism that Forza was feeling stale at that point. They probably also saw that everybody was flocking to Forza Horizon, which was, they're both Forza, but there's probably some competition there, right? Internally, I would imagine. I can't say for sure, but I think that they felt really challenged to go back and be like, all right, we need to really rethink Forza. We want to capture what people love about Horizon, but we want to stick to what makes Forza, the more serious kind of game. Being that they're Microsoft, they're clued into the new hardware and everything. it feels to me like this was their chance to step back and rebuild everything from scratch, almost like what Polyphony did with GT Sport, but because of their increased resources, they're able to do a full-scale game straight away. You know what I mean? That's just what's rattling around in my head about the difference. And I think to see the next level of that for Gran Turismo, it's going to be a long time. I don't think they have to reinvent the wheel with GT7 though, or with Gran Turismo, because they've done a lot of good research already that you can already see in GT7. But I think they need to redo some of those aspects and sort of push out environment details and make optimizations elsewhere. And also, I think targeting native 4K while pushing for high-end features is not the smartest thing this gen. And I think, doing that kind of ensured, I think they could have had ray tracing in game in GT7, but they would have absolutely had to given up native 4K. There's just no way they were going to combine those two, right? So, but yeah, Forza does feel like the proper new gen step up, and you can see that they've been working towards this for quite some time.
I agree. I think also the fact that they've basically desynced from having to deliver a new game every 2 years on the dot has been a massive. I mean, that's the reason why we got that fantastic series of features, right? And also the fact that Turn 10 are closely associated with the development of the Xbox hardware, based on what I learned when I visited Turn 10 in 2017. I actually saw Xbox One X, Forza Motorsport 7 at that point, and it was looking awesome. And seems that Turn 10 are the go-to studio when new hardware arrives at Microsoft, and quite rightly so. So yeah, I think there is just, in this case though, Polyphony versus Turn 10. I think the comparisons are actually fascinating. It's really interesting to see two highly accomplished technical developers take on what is essentially the same subject matter and to come up with very different solutions, which also have a lot of crossover at the same time. But in this case, Turn 10 have basically been taken off their regular rotation of games and have been allowed to innovate. And I think this is going to result in a pretty awesome game. But I do wonder whether we might see, as a consequence, that the cadence that we see for new iterations of the game may be stretched out further, which I'd like to see, but it may be the case that we get like more expansions, games as a service actually working out for the better, I think, in this particular case, quite possibly. Any input on this one, Alex?
Oh, I think actually John's point was really insightful about when they started their projects and maybe the size of the ability to scale up. And I think the only thing I would add is that it's not only like with Polyphony, they're almost by themselves, and not just like the outsourcing thing, but Turn 10 also has Playground. They are working with similar technology, so I'm sure there's a bit of a community there of sharing and of lesson learning that is not there on the GT side always. And I think that also is another thing which has allowed the project in terms of Forza Motorsport to probably be relatively quick, given the kind of next-gen look we're seeing here already. So that's the only thing I have to add. Really good comments, though, from you both.
I'm looking forward to doing a GT7 versus Forza Motorsport video again, maybe next year, because the thing that always strikes me is how, and this is why I don't like seeing people actually like fight about them per se, because I don't think that's not interesting. What's actually interesting here is just how dramatically different they look in many ways. You can see that the two developers focus on very different things. Like Polyphony has an eye for certain details where that Turn 10 doesn't have, and vice versa. And I think the thing I noticed, especially with like environment rendering, is that Turn 10 has this real eye for like a lot of like density and like standing back and looking at all the individual bits in the environment and making it hyper detailed. Whereas I think Polyphony's designs tend to be more like, what does it look like if you pull the camera back and compare it to a photograph? Like the actual granular detail isn't actually there, but it does what they do with their lighting and the specific design of things. It does go for a more photoreal kind of look, even though it's technically less detailed than what we're seeing. So it's just, I like seeing these two different approaches. I just think that's really cool. especially when you look at the cars, because you know those individual designers are going in and trying to replicate details in these cars, and each one is going to have, they're going for realism, but there's going to be an artistic difference in how they approach, like, how are we going to handle leather? How are we going to handle this cloth and, you know, the different headliners and, you know, this plastic on the headlight housing, and how are we going to do like the refraction off like the different headlight fixtures, and that stuff is so cool to me. I love it.
Next question from Jonas Larsen Tagizade. New Nintendo consoles usually have some kind of new unique selling point / gimmick in addition to higher performance. What could be the unique selling point of Switch 2? Could Nintendo innovate with machine learning outside upscaling? Or do you expect more like a GameCube situation in which more performance is the main selling point? John?
So Nintendo kind of has a tick and talk strategy with their releases, I feel, where they've had success with both wildly different innovative designs like the Wii, but then they've also had success with stuff like the Super Nintendo, which was just, you know, an update in terms of hardware power. I think the Wii U was sort of a continuation of Wii, and it faltered. The Switch then was another shift with this sort of portable design, but also a console. I think that this is going to be just the tick or the smaller jump for the next whatever revision of hardware, where it's going to continue the Switch model and essentially basically offer more power to the players. That's what I expect anyway. I don't see them doing any sort of like massive revolutionary thing, because frankly, I don't think they need to right now.
I don't think they're going to do anything special with machine learning though, because like I think I do think they're going to have DLSS in there from the new whatever the new SoC is there from NVIDIA, but I don't think they're going to push that in some other direction because there's a lot, like, I don't think they have like ML scientists working at Nintendo doing these things. I think whatever tech they're going to get is going to be kind of like the off-the-shelf stuff that NVIDIA can provide specifically for their project. And it'll be, of course, custom to a degree, but I think they're not going to be pushing some new software paradigm there, I don't think.
I think to add to what John was saying, the problem with gimmicks is that it's hit and miss, right? So if you get it right, like they did with Wii, it's, you know, basically pretty incredible. And I'd say that it's the gimmick, if you could call it that, for Switch was also a great business decision because it allowed them to consolidate their mobile and home console development teams into one specific platform. So this was like a major win, and I don't think that they would trade that win for anything. So I think if the gimmick, the new idea, if you can call it that, is still the fact that it is a hybrid console, and I suspect that the issues we've had with it as a hybrid console, in that the sort of experience when docked to your TV isn't great, is probably going to be one of the major focuses of innovation for Switch 2, and that does involve DLSS.
This raises an interesting thing. I you know, it really highlights to me how much the Wii U was this weird middle point where it tried to be like the Wii, but it didn't achieve that nearly as well. But it's also like the Switch, but before they could actually take it portable, right? Like, it feels like they were trying to make the jump to the Switch by transitioning the Wii brand into this thing. They didn't have the technology to make a Switch yet, but they still wanted to try. And the whole thing was muddled and confusing, and it did neither of those things well, and it just ended up failing as a result. So it is kind of like their stopgap, but I don't think what comes next will be that.
Let's move on to the next question. This one from Dubak Nathan. DF seems to like 4K gaming. You guys use it as a baseline for PC videos, and it is the goal for current gen consoles. Do you think 4K gaming is relevant? Is it worth the effort? Personally, I have a 1080p monitor. While I am aware of the limitations, I play most of my games at a slightly higher resolution than downsampled to 1080p to get rid of TAA blurriness. To me, doing this at 1440p seems to be more than enough, and 4K feels overkill. What's your take? What is your take, Alex?
I think you're doing the right thing there. I don't think 4K is always worth it. It limits you to 60 FPS really easily because driving anything higher is kind of absurd. Usually, next-gen GPUs will change that probably. And I think like that 1440p is usually a sweet spot for IQ. 1080p a little less so. I think 1080p is good, but I think 1440p is like a really beautiful middle ground. The one thing I would recommend for you is maybe not to use 1440p. I don't know. Are you on NVIDIA? Let's just assume you are, since like so much of the market is. Try out, if you can, DLDSR instead of 1440p DSR downsampled. You may actually get an even better image quality for not too much more performance. So that is my only recommendation to you, Nathan. I think you got a good thing going there.
I would say please upgrade from a 1080p screen to 1440p.
1440p is nice, to say the least.
Yeah, and you get the sweet spot also of typically these screens are high refresh rate as well. If I had to choose between 1440p at 90 to 120 frames per second versus 4K at 60, I'd probably choose 1440p. I think the reason why we use it as a baseline for PC videos, typically it's well, you can chime in on this one, Alex, but I guess it's because we kind of are beholden to the formats that YouTube supports, and because of the console comparison. What do you reckon?
Yeah, it's both those. You really can barely show off the benefits of high frame rate in a 60 FPS video without slowing down the video. And then it's also like, it's just not as cool at that point, I think. And the consoles dictate a bit of the comparison point. And I usually think consoles in this regard make some dumb decisions at times. They're pretty good at like getting the optimized settings, but I think they're still usually going for too high of a res. Like, I think like if they just went a little bit lower and sometimes pushed up in some areas, like anisotropic filtering is the one that I'm like always surprised at. So, you know, like you get to see these really obvious benefits of PC when I show those kind of things. But at the same time, I'm not always showing the optimal use case. I'm just kind of showing the comparison. So I really wish I could show off like 1440p, high refresh rate kind of stuff, but it's just not really doable in the YouTube format, unfortunately.
The thing about all this that gets me is that, so 4K gaming is definitely relevant. One, all the display technology improvements are happening pretty much only in the high resolution space. So on the TV side, it's all 4K. If you're going 1080p, you're using ancient old panel technology, and it's not a good choice. On the PC monitor side, though, I think you guys made the right point. Refresh rate more important than resolution. But the reason I think I use a fairly high res monitor, and I know you guys do as well, and it has more to do with the work side of things. Like for gaming, yeah, 1440 is fine, 1080 is even okay, fine. It's more about the real estate you have while working. Like using Adobe Premiere at 1080p feels extremely claustrophobic to me. Like it's like, oh, I can barely see anything is what it feels like.
Yeah.
It's not great at 1440p either, even ultra wide.
Yeah.
No, it's not. So I tend to feel like monitor choice has to do, it's not just about gaming on the PC side, right? It also depends on what you're doing with your PC.
Okay, let's try and power through the remaining questions. The next one from Alces. I know John has played around with a Mister, but are you guys aware of the RGB-Pi? I haven't used one yet and am mulling over whether it's worth a look. What is the RGB-Pi, John, and is it worth looking at?
Yeah, so the RGB-Pi is essentially an adapter cable and OS thing that allows you to connect a Raspberry Pi to a CRT monitor. And you can get actual proper like 15 kilohertz like signals to those. And it is a cool idea. I'm not a big Pi fan per se in the past necessarily, but that is something. When I saw that, I was kind of thinking maybe I should get into this and play with it. So I really don't usually use just straight emulators, I admit, but there's nothing wrong with them. And this seems like an awesome way to make it look and feel a lot more authentic. And Raspberry Pis are very capable these days. You can do some amazing stuff with it. So it does seem to be worth using.
Next question from WM Cheerman. Would you rather play a single-player game at 60 FPS with DLSS quality or 90 to 120 with DLSS performance? Interesting question, right, Alex?
It's a hard one. It's really dependent upon the game.
Surely depends on the game.
Yeah, so
absolutely.
And FPS, definitely the latter of those two. FPS games at like 90 to 120 is pretty great, or just straight 120 for that matter. But if it's like, I don't know, like a third person really slow-paced game. Like, Control's hard. I actually think Control at high frame rate is really, really cool, but it's just such a heavy game that you don't do it too often, and you really want those ray tracing features. So that's hard. I'd say slower game, definitely DLSS quality. Like, let's say, I don't know. That's a hard one. What games would I say it would do that
I mean,
with?
for me, Alex, I went with Cyberpunk, DLSS quality, all the ray tracing maxed out, and with VRR, it's like, 45 to 60 FPS most of the time. I thought that was fine. I would not give that up for higher frame rates.
Yeah, in that game, that one's hard because like it's still going to be heavy even in performance mode.
It's so heavy.
So yeah, I think that the key thing here is the type of title, but the differences in motion between DLSS quality and DLSS performance will depend upon the game. Sometimes performance will do like hair not as well as quality mode, and if the game has a lot of hair on screen, well, then maybe you do want that quality. So
let's move on to the final two questions. This one should be fairly straightforward. No idea why it's being posed, but let's go for it. Fans Tech Girl asks, what type of milk do you all like in your tea? I'll take the first response to that. Don't drink tea, do drink coffee, and I have, it's called Best of Both, I think. Bob. It's no fat, but tastes like proper milk. I will take a photo and supply it to Audi. And if I don't, I'm sure he'll put some sort of comedy version in. Alex, next. What do you reckon?
I drink tea occasionally, but I don't drink it with milk. I just love it laying up, straight up.
Same. I mean, in my coffee, I have Oatly, which I love, is oat milk. That's delicious.
But the barista variant?
Yeah, exactly. The barista variant. I love that.
Delicious.
But
it
in
is
the
good.
tea, I sometimes use milk, but usually not. Whenever I visit England, I always have milk in my tea because it just feels proper somehow. But when I'm over here, it's like, just straight tea.
Okay, good. Let's move on to the final question. This one, and I'm really going to apologize in advance. Harris Red Zegpajik. I'm so sorry. This is disaster. Anyway, the question actually had two questions. The first one was our reactions to Forza Motorsport, and I think we've done that across this video and also in Alex's excellent standalone content. But this was a secondary question. What country would you guys like to visit soon that you may not have had the chance to visit in the last 4 years? John?
In the last 4 years that I've maybe not
Well,
been.
obviously the last 2 years travel has been effectively impossible.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess what countries would you like to visit now that restrictions are rising?
Dang, I definitely want to go up north in Europe and explore some, go to Sweden and Norway, of course. But then I haven't been down to Korea, South Korea. I would like to visit that. I want to get back to Japan and see some friends and folks over there again. And then I'm going to the US soon, but that's just to visit family, so it's not quite the same thing. But yeah, that's about right.
So, Alex, you're a younger man, possibly not as well-traveled as John and I.
I definitely am not.
Countries you'd like to visit?
Well, I've always really wanted to go to Japan and travel the country there. And I haven't usually had the opportunity and or money, but now I have a bit more money and opportunities are coming up soon enough that in a couple of years, I'd probably like to go there and check it out.
I'm planning next year, possibly, Alex.
Oh, well, we'll see.
Me and some friends, so maybe if you want to tag along.
Yeah, it could be a thing. Yeah, that's a place I've always wanted to go. And there's also, there's like countries that I've never been to, like in terms of like the Balkan countries, I've never been there. And I've always felt like I really should go to any one of them. But they're oddly enough, at least now, due to just rising costs everywhere, they're becoming actually a bit more expensive, which makes traveling to them not as easy. So I don't know. My next, I was going to make the joke that I want to go visit Brandenburg, which is the place where I technically live, because you'd be surprised at how beautiful your local area can be if you go out and check it out. So other countries are cool, but sometimes finding new stuff at home is also interesting.
Difficult question. I've been thinking about this since last night when I added it to the doc. I mean, I've been to the major places through work, So I've been to Japan many times, not for a long time, but I have been many times. US, I've completely forgotten how many times I've been. Europe, funnily enough, I haven't been to Italy. I'd quite like to go. France, which is literally right next door to the UK. I went there. I haven't been there since I was 11.
Oh my god!
Go again.
Goodness me. It's great.
Yeah. So yeah, I don't really know. There's no real sort of. I think the highlight of my recent travels. This was for my 10-year wedding anniversary. Went to the Maldives, which was just basically like living on a private island, basically, which was quite phenomenal. Beyond that, wow, I'd have to put a bit more thought into it because I have been to sort of all the major countries. Australia, I've done. Quite a lot of Europe I haven't done, which maybe I should do. So I guess that would be my answer there. But certainly much to think about there. That's it. That's the end of the show. And if you enjoyed it, please do like, subscribe, share, ring the bell for those Notionally instant notifications. Notionally, that is my disclaimer. You may or may not get a notification. DF Supporter Program, pose questions, join our amazing Discord community, get involved with the retro scene we got going there. It's absolutely phenomenal. Early access, bonus material. We're really proud of it.
The PS Triple video's up right now.
Oh yeah,
PS Triple, yeah.
Check it out.
John ain't talking about that Wii. That Wii shit. He's talking about the PS3 1080p, 85 games tested to see whether they are actually running at 1080p or not. And the results are actually very, very surprising. So yeah, do check that out. But that's all from us for now. Thanks for watching. That Wii shit.